So thank you so much to everybody for a whirlwind, but really important and impactful and important discussion over the last 2 days. So for the final time, my name is Belinda Hlatrayo, and I have the honor of welcoming Ms. Neve Collier-Smith, the UNDP resident representative for UNDP Thailand, to give us a vote of thanks and closing remarks. Over to Neve.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for allowing me to share a few moments of your conference with you. To Brooke, and please also pass our best wishes to Sylvia for a speedy recovery, and all the distinguished guests, colleagues and friends that joined the discussion today. It's my real pleasure to say a few words in conclusion of this Corporate Sustainability and Environmental Rights in Asia conference. I want to start by saying thank you to all the people involved, and there have been many of them, including our partners at the UN Environment Programme, at the United Nations Children's Fund, at the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Your continued collaboration and dedication to this topic has made not just these 2 days meaningful, but also created this excellent platform for knowledge sharing and collaboration that I hope that will extend long past the conference is finished. I know now that over the last 2 days, and I wish I'd had the time to stay fully with you during those 2 days, but I know that you've engaged in a really dynamic discussion, that you've shared some innovative solutions, and that I hope you've forged some seeds for what will be new partnerships for corporate sustainability in Asia coming out of this session. And from discussions with many of you in the sidelines and from listening to my team, there's a very clear takeaway. And it's that businesses must move beyond disclosure to really meaningful action, embedding their human rights and environmental due diligence into core strategies, into their decision-making processes, and importantly, into their supply chains. Transparency and disclosures are great, and this is an important first step, but it isn't enough. Corporate sustainability has to really be focused on the impact, about preventing harm and driving positive change. And this is important, as you have discussed, not least because businesses aren't just market players anymore. By ensuring that their corporate actions align with the right to a clean, healthy, and safe environment, businesses can be at the heart of driving social change. Now, as a host country for this conference, Thailand itself has made significant strides in advancing this agenda, including through key regulatory measures. And it's our pleasure as UNDP in Thailand to work closely with the government on its efforts in this respect. Like, for example, there's the new Draft Climate Change Act, aiming for carbon neutrality by 2050 and net zero emissions by 2065. There's the second National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, which recognizes environmental issues and climate change as emerging human rights concerns. There's mandatory ESG reporting, or one reporting requirements, for all Thai-listed companies, integrating human rights and climate action into corporate disclosures. And there's also the development of mandatory human rights due diligence, which is underway. Now, some Thai businesses, particularly some large corporations, are already taking very active measures, lowering carbon and methane emissions, reducing deforestation risks in their supply chains, and embracing circular economy principles. However, for sustainability to be fully realized, these efforts have to extend to all large corporations and, importantly, beyond that, to really include small and medium-sized enterprises, which here in Thailand account for about 90% of the business community. SMEs, again, as I know you've discussed, face challenges in adopting sustainability practices. It could be due to limited financial resources, technical knowledge, or access to green technologies. Some still engage in harmful environmental activities, such as deforestation, poor waste management, and each contributing to climate change and pollution. And if left unaddressed, these environmental issues will exacerbate social problems, economic insecurity, inequality, and poverty, and ultimately impact the fundamental right to right to health, the right to work, the right to education, and even the right to life. Like many countries in the region, Thailand is facing challenges in making progress towards particular sustainable development goals, especially those related to the environment. SDG 13 on climate action, SDG 14 on life below water, and SDG 15 on life on land. Now, stepping up action, public and private action, in the ways that you have talked about over the last 2 days, is therefore an opportunity to accelerate SDG progress across all of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I stress public and private action because, of course, this isn't just about the business community. As is the case for nearly all the Sustainable Development Goals, impact happens when different sectors and different parts of society work together. Governments have a catalytic role to play in this transformation. With policy guidance, financial incentives, and capacity building support, they can create the environment, especially for SMEs, to transition towards more sustainable operations. A well-supported policy framework can help to ensure inclusivity, leveling the playing field for all businesses, regardless of size or sector. Parliamentarians and lawmakers have a role to play. Evidence suggests that countries that enshrine environmental protections into their constitution, countries such as Argentina, Costa Rica, and the Philippines, are more likely to be successful in reducing their ecological footprint and pollution levels. And crucially, civil society has a role to play. They help to monitor and report environmental violations, to help hold corporations and policymakers to account, and to empower communities to take action against real environmental threats. Now, despite this important role, we know that environmental defenders across the region are facing growing threats. Strategic lawsuits against public participation, or SLAPs, are increasingly being used to silence activists, weakening freedom of expression. A UNDP report, for example, found that between 1997 and 2022, 109 SLAP cases were initiated by businesses and state enterprises, with over half, or 52% of those, related to natural resources and environmental concerns. This is a cause for great concern, because environmental defenders are allies in ensuring sustainable development, human rights, and democracy. They're playing their role in this process, and that role really must be protected. So as we close the conference today, the real work is only going to begin. As UNDP, we remain committed to working with governments, businesses, financial institutions to integrate sustainability and human rights into business practices. We'll continue to support regulatory alignment, responsible investment, and practical implementation tools across Asia. And we urge business leaders, policymakers, and civil society actors to take the insights from this conference and to turn them into action. The path ahead, we know it, and you talked about it for the last 2 days, requires bold leadership. It's going to require continued meaningful collaboration and unwavering commitment, not just to adapt to change, but to drive it. And I hope that together you'll take the work forward from here and build businesses which are not just accountable, but also lead the way in sustainability, human rights, and environmental stewardship. With that, thank you so much for your time. Kopkunika.
Should I? Okay, great. Thank you very much to the resident representative for these inspiring remarks as we start the closing session. My name is Brooke Yamakoshi, and I am a water, sanitation, and hygiene manager with UNICEF's East Asia and Pacific Regional Office here in Bangkok. It's really a pleasure to be with you and to have joined some of the very rich discussions today. So now we're going to briefly turn, just in a moment, turn it over to a panel discussion to hear some of the key insights and reflections on the past 2 days. And in this, we really want to focus on how we can ensure meaningful collaboration between businesses, communities, workers, young people, and environmental defenders. We also want to discuss emerging regulatory, environmental, and social trends, and how businesses can adapt to evolving expectations while ensuring long-term resilience. So by way of introduction, I wanted to share a few summary points from the co-organizers of this event over these 2 days. And as we just heard from the resident representative, we've heard this week that the erosion of the rule of law and civic space in Asia and the Pacific is a major concern. Latin America and this region, the Asia and Pacific region, were the two most dangerous regions for environmental human rights defenders in 2023. And over the past 2 days, we've heard that businesses must respect human rights, operate in an environmentally sustainable way, complying with environmental laws, and ensure that there are no violations of human or environmental rights in their operations or value chains. This approach is really essential if we want to tackle the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, and leave no one behind. We also heard that there will be a 6th forum of ministers of and environmental authorities of Asia and the Pacific that will take place in August of this year in Nandi, Fiji. And this is a vital regional preparatory meeting prior to the 7th session of the UN Environment Assembly, taking place in December this year in Nairobi. The common theme, Advancing Sustainable Solutions for a Resilient Planet, sends an important message to maintain and increase ambition for the environmental agenda in these challenging and uncertain times. So we also heard a lot on sustainable financing and on private sector engagement, that sustainable financing must not only raise more money, but also ensure that existing funds are directly accessible to the sectors that are most in need. On private sector engagement, we heard how it is a prerequisite for a whole-of-ecosystem strategy towards environmental sustainability. Businesses are not only sources of capital, but also drivers of technological innovation and enablers of social change through their market-wide influence. So with these short reflections, I want to now turn it over to our panel, and I'd like to introduce our distinguished panelists. First, we have Mr. Mohammed Jamil, who is the Joint Secretary for Development in the Ministry of Climate Change in Pakistan. And seated next to him, we have Ang Wen, who is a member of the UNICEF East Asia and Pacific Regional Office's Young People's Action Team, or YPAT. And to her left, we have Dindo Kamiplan, who is the Regional Director of for Oceania of IUCN. Seated to my right is Ben Hardman, who is the Mekong Legal Director at Earth Rights International, and seated next to him is our colleague Ghislaine Nadad, who is the Senior Sustainable Investing Specialist at Robeco. Thank you. And so now, for our first question, we wanted to really get some reflections from our panelists about the priorities that they heard this week. So I'd like to start with Mr. Jamil. What do you think are the most urgent priorities for businesses, governments, and civil society in ensuring corporate sustainability and environmental rights in Asia?
Honorable participants, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, good evening. There was a time when business being the earning of profits, and the government was concerned with the taxes, and the people had their demand of goods. But now that time has changed. Basically, the environmental concern has changed the entire spectrum. Now, we have realization that without environment protections, no business viability is there. Neither the buyers are ready to buy the things, nor it is the government which can afford to ignore the environmental considerations. These environmental considerations have led to another shift in the business. So that is, now we are going to have AI tools, we are going to have automations, and we are going to have robotics and other such interventions. These interventions are likely to displace the jobs. So now the business interventions for the sake of environment are not enough, but there is now another allied issue, and the allied issue is human rights issue. Now the buyers are no more the passive buyers. They are very much sensitive about the environmental issues as well as the human rights issues. So for that matter, the priorities have been changed now. So the priorities on the part of government, the priorities on the part of businesses, and the priorities of the civil societies. So all they have, or rather they will have to change their priorities. For the businesses, we were just discussing there was a mechanism of CSR, but there were loopholes in the system as well. Now we are having the ESG system. I hope that this will work, and the businesses should set this strategy, and letter and spirit, they should follow it. Without this, I don't see there will be any viable solution for the governments, because for human right action, we will need money. So from where this money will come? Apparently, there is the constitution of this ESG. As far as the environment is concerned, the businesses will adopt principle of circular economies. They will invest in clean and renewable energies, and obviously they will be having more and more demand for these things. They will set science-based targets aligned with the Paris Agreement. They will be strengthening the environmental, social, and governmental reporting system for ESG purposes, ensure fair labor practices, protect forest, ocean, and ecosystem, will consider reskilling and upskilling of the employees so that the job displacement is minimum. The businesses will coordinate with the governments and local communities to have policies and intervention for social protections. Now it will be mandatory for all three stakeholders to sit together and to find out the solution. Otherwise, none can be in the advantageous position. Yes, the government, they will have to take these strict regulatory measures. They will have to update their policy interventions for this interest of environmental protections, as well as they will have to oversee and reset the priorities to ensure the human rights and social protections. They will provide incentive for businesses investing in sustainability. Yes, the government will have to incentivize the businesses in terms of taxes and in any way to promote the environment and environment-friendly businesses. Similarly, the government can take financial steps which may include green bonds and such sort of financial arrangements. The other thing is that this is not the local issue, but the environment is also trans-boundary issue. So the governments and particularly the neighbors and even over the globe, the people will have to have discussions to resolve these issues at the global level. Yes, the society, if the society will be passive and sleeping, so they will not be able to ensure their the protection, human rights protections, nor they will be able to save the environment. The society will have to be very much active. Society means the NGOs, the media, the youth, and everyone. They will continue to pressurize the corporations and the governments to uphold the environment as well as the human rights, hold businesses accountable for environmental violations, push the stronger environmental laws and legal mechanisms, promote eco-friendly products and ethical consumerism, mobilize local communities to resist harmful corporate practices, foster climate adaptation initiative at the local levels. So for the last 2 days, what we have been discussing, so I gathered these things. So these are my views. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jamil. This is very comprehensive for us and great reflections here, very rich on businesses, governments, and civil society and how their roles complement each other. Maybe, Ang, now I would like to move on to you. Same question. What do you see as the most urgent priorities coming out of these discussions from the past couple of days?
Thank you, Brooke. So the world is burning, livelihoods are collapsing, and yet corporations continue to use sustainability as a brand strategy rather than a fundamental obligation. The uncomfortable truth is that these corporations, these businesses champion ESG only when it profits them, not when it conflicts with their bottom lines. Where are they when these cause of decarbonization fails or falls on precarious workers, informal economies, and climate vulnerable women and children? So, priorities. 1, institutionalizing gender responsive and youth inclusive climate action. Women and youth remain the main shock absorbers of corporate inaction. As we push for a just transition, we have to ask, just for who? If decision-making bodies are not legally bound to include gender-responsive and youth-inclusive indicators, then corporate sustainability is failing the very people that it claims to protect. Sustainability education as well has to be gender-responsive, where women and children should have access to knowledge and opportunities necessary to transition into the green economy. 2, end financial and informational gatekeeping. Sustainability financing disproportionately favors corporations, while youth-led and grassroots initiatives remain underfunded and structurally excluded. Funding must be inclusive and flexible. Sustainability must be accessible to all stakeholders, not just industry insiders. 3, accountability must be legally blinding, not voluntary. I think we can stop pretending that voluntary commitments work. Businesses must be legally bound by mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, not just encouraged to strive towards ESG practices. This means binding gender-responsive and youth-inclusive ESG disclosures, legally enforceable climate transition plans that do not externalize the costs onto vulnerable groups and workers, independent verification of supply chain claims. Self-reported progress is a conflict of interest, and I'd like to quote Angela Davis. She reminds us that I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. There is no neutral position in this fight. To remain silent, to hesitate, to delay action, these are the choices that sustain injustice. And in 2025, where transparency should be the norm, obfuscation is a betrayal. And the crisis we face is not a lack of knowledge at all, it is a lack of will. And for those in positions of power, I ask you this one question: will history remember you as an architect of real change or as the enablers of a systemic failure? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ang. A very clear call on equity and accountability, so thank you very much for that. Dindo, I would now like to turn to you from IUCN's perspective on some of the priorities that you see emerging from the past 2 days.
Thank you, Brooke. I assume you mean meaningful actions we're going to take after these 2 days. And I was just reflecting from yesterday, and I realized that before we can do meaningful action, we also need to build on meaningful thinking and meaningful conversation. And I'm saying that because I think one priority, which I observe even from this meeting, is how we can adopt and build on a common language as the foundation of acting together. By common language isn't just about making sure that we understand each other, but that we actually mean and we look at the same vision for us. 2 very practical examples. We look at it from the theme of this conference, ecosystem. Around this room, we have very different understanding of what ecosystem is, depends whether you're from the private sector or you're from IUCN or from local communities, right? I've heard it in the corridors and the coffee breaks. Something very simple like that. In many of the sessions, I also heard people using terms interchangeably: environment, nature, biodiversity. I mean, there are subtle differences, but they're very important when you start target setting. So to me, language is important, also because it's a foundation of what we agree to do next. But beyond that, it's also important when you say language, language that allows us to connect and to convene. And let's try to avoid language that divides us, language that sounds dogmatic, nor language that seems to romanticize. We should promote a marketplace of ideas and opinion. This is the point of this whole conference. I'd like to see more of this. We've seen part of that this week. Second one is we also call this conference, by the theme responsibility, right? I think we have heard from yesterday and moving forward that we cannot continue to convince, whether it's private sector or government or communities, to invest in nature or biodiversity because it is a social responsibility. It cannot just be that. We cannot use social responsibility as the basis. In the case of the private sector, for example, they must invest in nature because they believe it is good for their business and their business models. That's the only way. We cannot look at the business as charity, as investing in nature because it's part of a CSR budget. I think that is important. And I said this in the previous edition. If we want to change the business of nature, we need to start by changing the nature of business. This conference proceeding is also very important because it provides us insight, but we already knew this in the past and we reinforce it today. The basic principles underlying responsibility in the corporate and other sectors. We agree, there's consensus. We talk about giving voice to the unheard. We talk about a whole of ecosystem, whole of society approach, enabling the disenfranchised. I think we need to get beyond that now because we have already agreed on the principles. Can we agree on something concrete, tangible, time-bound, and something that we can hold ourselves accountable for? I'll give you a few examples. Yesterday in the session where I joined, we talked about the COPs. I don't know if Sean is still around here, right? What can we do from today? When we go home, remember, countries, our states, we're supposed to submit their updated NDCs 10th of February. You can count how many countries have resubmitted, which means, look at the list. When you go back, we talk about how indigenous people, local communities, private sector can be engaged. Go and check. If your country hasn't submitted their revised NDCs, that is a quick opportunity. The same for the NBSAPs, for biodiversity. You can just look at the CBD Secretariat. I think those are two very concrete ways of using the knowledge that came out of this conference to go out there and influence. Because your countries, our countries, they're supposed to have submitted that. I also made a play yesterday about things that we have already agreed on but are not yet enforced. And my favorite example is the Treaty of the High Seas. Biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. We talk about biodiversity, but much of the biodiversity out there is beyond national jurisdiction. Countries adopted it 2 years ago. How many have ratified it? Far from the 60 that is required for the treaty to take effect and be binding. So look at the list. So what I'm saying is there are very concrete ways that we can take action beyond the ideas that we shared today. Let's focus on those because we have already agreed on the underlying principles. I think my last message is around the private business sector because we talk about it. I think it's very important, especially in the context of Asia, that we cannot view the private business sector as something monolithic. Private business sectors as diverse as they could be, between SMEs, between global corporates, state enterprises, startups. While we agree that there are certain types of behaviors and performance and objectives that are common across, let's focus on those that are distinct of each of those, and avoid applying the same generic observation across everything and accuse the entire private business sector of the same, if you say, crimes or the same misbehaviors. They're not. There are a lot good private sector as there are what you probably call bad. But that's not the point. The point is that's why we come together, because we agree to learn together, to co-create, and to take action together. And I think that's the best and most effective and most important outcome of this conference. Thank you, Brooke.
Great, thank you very much, Tindo. A very clear call to action to move from the discussions that we've had here and the things that we all agree on to see how we can find some concrete actions together coming out of this 2 days. So thank you very much. I'd like to turn now to my right and maybe starting with Ben, move on to talk a little bit about how you see that businesses can effectively collaborate with communities, with workers, and with environmental defenders to build trust and improve risk management in the evolving regulatory landscape, a topic I think we've spent a lot of time on over these past 2 days.
Thank you. And I think what I'd like to say follows on really well from the previous panelists. I mean, Earthrights, our background is we see the worst cases. We see the worst examples of pollution, of human rights abuses. And I fully agree that the corporate sector is very diverse. And I think what we need is to see companies, investors that are responsibly minded to work with civil society to create more accountability. You know, for some things, for some communities, things have improved over the last 2 decades. Total Energies went into Myanmar in 1992, shortly after the last military takeover. This time around, they felt the need to divest because of pressure from shareholders, albeit they did so irresponsibly. The parent company litigation that was talked about in the first session is more possible because of the UN guiding principles. You can't say our subsidiary has nothing to do with us when you tell all your investors that you monitor your whole supply chain and your whole group. And so, look, how can companies engage? Earthrights, if you look at our website, we have what we call the LEAD tools, local engagement, action, and dialogue tools. We didn't create these. These are ones that just are widely used. They focus on participatory action research. So, for example, we work with communities in Tilawa, a special economic zone outside Yangon, where they designed their own grievance mechanism, presented that to the SEZ management committee, to funders like JICA, who flat out said, no, we want nothing to do with that. But that kind of thing that is community-led is what companies can do most effectively, I think. That includes as well things like community health impact assessments. So rather than having just an EIA, you have a community-led process where they do their own impact assessment. You can have community benefit agreements where communities are given concrete rights that they can enforce. And I think, you know, as my background is, I'm a lawyer, that question, what can companies do? But can and must are very, very, very different. And this morning's session talked about trust, a trust deficit. And I think that's completely the wrong approach. There's an accountability deficit. As a former corporate lawyer, if I'd said to my clients, invest this money, bet your company, just trust them, it'll be okay, I wouldn't have been a lawyer very long. You don't trust. You have measures, you have contracts, you have insurance. You do need some trust, but you need the backup for when things go wrong. For most investments, there won't be terrible human rights abuses, but for the ones that are, you need this accountability and not trust. The OECD guidelines say government should put in place binding measures for companies to raise complaints and then ask communities to have voluntary things. So I think after 500 years of extractivism, saying to indigenous peoples, trust us, it's a form of gaslighting. Companies respond to incentives. The polluter pays principle isn't new. That needs to be actually put into practice. I'm going to give you 2 examples that Earthrights has worked on. One is we were founded over a lawsuit against Unocal, now Chevron, for a pipeline in Myanmar that resulted in rape, torture, and murder. And that was possible under the Alien Tort Statute, a bit of Byzantine, well, not quite Byzantine, 18th century legislation. It's since been narrowed down and it's almost impossible to use. But it enabled communities to hold a company to account. And the response has been for the courts to narrow that down and to replace it with voluntary guidelines. So rather than saying, oh gosh, we should probably be liable for murder, the corporate response from the worst companies has been, let's have some voluntary guidelines. And so the other example is the IFC. The IFC lent money to Denant, a Honduran company. They were told, if you do this, bad things will happen. They did it anyway, bad things happened. The Ombudsman said this was our fault, your fault, for not following your own standards. 40 campesinos were murdered. And the response at the IFC was, oh well, we have immunity from suit. They said we have immunity when they were sued. And so eventually, with communities, Earthrights was able to sue them in the US, confirm they don't have immunity, and a settlement was reached. But you can't talk about trust when the IRC's response to that kind of egregious human rights abuse is immunity. And so when we talk about the evolving regulatory landscape, let's look how we deal with the other regulatory issues: bribery, corruption, money laundering. We have in place very strong methods to deal with those. When I was a lawyer in the UK, money laundering, to clamp down on that, the government said, as a lawyer, when you take a client's money, if you don't know where it's from, you lose your license or go to prison. And so that made us as lawyers much more effective at doing anti-money laundering work. The SEC, in most countries, stock exchanges, you can be sued for misleading shareholders. Ships have insurance that if they cause pollution, both governments and communities can claim for damages. So there are all these measures already exist. So I'm not suggesting that we treat human rights differently. We're just saying that if you want genuine regulation, if you really care about it, it needs to be more. Stakeholder engagement can prevent reputational harm, but that's not enough. Companies and governments didn't think the risk of misleading shareholders, the risk of bribery and corruption would be stopped by reputational harm. We went further, we had binding regulations, and it needs to be the same for human rights.
Great. Thank you very much, Ben. Very thought-provoking reflections on how to create and have a call for greater accountability in the way that the role that communities can also participate in that. So thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn to Ghislaine, who's been very patient, for your views on collaboration.
Thank you, and I will give a view from an investor perspective. Well, I agree that with Ben that we have to hold companies accountable if they don't meet human rights standards and expectations, but I also think that as an investor we can do that via, for example, divestment, but that is really the last resort, because I think then we lose all the influence that we have. And first of all, we have to use our influence to improve the situation, or to try to improve the situation. So how can we do that? We can do that via engagement with companies that we invest in. And in our engagement, as I also explained this morning, we touch upon, we include as an engagement objectives that companies have to do stakeholder engagement, meaning stakeholder engagement. How can businesses more effectively collaborate with communities and workers and environmental defenders and improve that stakeholder engagement? Well, I think for ourselves, as we are further away from what is happening on the ground, we have to have that discussions with the companies. They have to show evidence to us, explain challenges, and we have to have more direct communication with the stakeholders. So how can we do that? We can do that via engagement with NGOs, via engagement with industry initiatives. For example, the RSPO has also representatives of environmental and social NGOs. So that is how we can get information and also collaborate with stakeholders. I think we also have to think out of the box to improve collaboration with rights holders as an investor. So that would mean invite specific groups to a roundtable that we organize with other investors to listen and